I was born in a Japanese town nestled in the shadow of a mountain in a clinic staffed by Catholic nuns. Decades later, I found myself studying fine arts, wondering how I got here and why. Trying to make sense of it all, I began to make artworks that addressed my personal and familiar histories. Histories that not many people in the School of Visual Art share. An art practice that made these histories visible became a practice of self-othering. I then began to make works of institutional critique, a practice that fostered an antagonistic relationship towards an institution that nurtured something I adored, art. After graduating, I found a reprieve by exploring the concept of identity, turning the personal impersonal. A quote that resonated with me at the time and continues to resonate with me today is one from Bell Hooks. I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around me and within me. Most importantly, I wanted to make the herd go away. I saw in theory then a vocation for healing. By reading theory, I felt less alone, knowing that there were people out there who felt the same way I did, who identified the same problems and articulated them with great depth and sincerity. I'd like to say that through this project, I'm somehow carrying the torch, but really, I have no idea what I'm doing, and I'm looking forward to your questions and thoughts, which might help me articulate this. My presentation is split into 3.5 parts. The first addresses the matter of diversity, the research problem. I want to highlight that the issue of diversity is not solely a matter of demographic representation of people and bodies, also semiotic representation, how these people and bodies are seen and understood. This asymmetry obscures the different ways we can approach the topics of race and ethnicity. So part 2 covers the typical or essentialist aligned strategies of representation, something I'll define later. And part 3 addresses the atypical or non-essentialist aligned strategies of representation. Overall, my research project aims to highlight 6 tools we have in unpacking and navigating the topics of race and ethnicity in the visual art practices. Part 1, diversity. It's a bit everywhere, so I've got a little roller coaster. My final undergraduate artwork appropriated John Baldessari's "I will not make any more art." Over 5 days, I repeated the phrase, "I will not make any more political art," while wearing printed overalls. These overalls feature an email from then head of sculpture and spatial practice, and loosely says, very loosely, the School of Visual Art agrees that there is a lack of diversity. There are programs in place to help address that, but more can always be done. Such statements reflect the belief that improving the racial and ethnic diversity within our art institutions relies on hiring the right staff and enrolling the right students. And as much as it would help in many ways, and it really does, this perspective presents the problem of diversity as an issue of demographics. This allows institutions to highlight the underrepresentation of culturally and linguistically diverse peoples working in the visual arts, a trend supported by this study by the Australian Council of the Arts. An approach that partly shifts the responsibility onto these communities to become more involved. Once admitted, however, they're further burdened with the expectations of representing their cultures and guiding these institutions towards greater sensitivity regarding racial and ethnic issues. By asking ourselves how much diversity is enough, demographic diversity begins to resemble a Lacanian object d'art, something desired for the sake of desiring, and by design an unattainable cycle of desire, a solution art institutions advocate to appear progressive while knowingly or otherwise obscuring the institutionalized barriers to true diversity. Linda Nochlin highlights the need to interrogate such institutionalized inequities in her essay, "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" In the field of art history, the Western male viewpoint is unconsciously accepted as a viewpoint of the art historian, a series of intellectual distortions which must be corrected in order to achieve a more adequate and accurate view of historical situations. Therefore, it might be necessary for art institutions to confront this intellectual distortion and classify a large part of what is studied in undergraduate fine art programs and fine art programs in general, Western European and British American art history. But we mustn't overlook the uncomfortable contrast to this institutionalized repression, the valorization of non-Western European and non-British American histories, the possible overcompensation for lack lack of diversity. But Nochlin also identified that the very position of women as a knowledge outside of the maverick is seen as a decided advantage rather than merely a hindrance or a subjective distortion. The subjective distortion raises the need to further interrogate the complexities of ethnicization, the transitive verb meaning to make ethnic. Ethnicization is most felt in critiques, which can sometimes be marred by naive or insensitive comments. The ways in which the topics of race and ethnicity are discussed often contributes to feelings of alienation. These issues can dominate a critique, railroad the discussion to broad issues, and are often rehashed in every consecutive critique. Alternatively, lacking the confidence to speak to such issues, the group may relinquish the conversation to ethnicized students, who are then left to discuss the topic amongst themselves. These dynamics rarely reflect the good intentions of critique participants. Instead, they point towards a systemic lack in the language used to discuss matters of race and ethnicity. Undergraduate students who wish to pursue further studies might find that postgraduate critiques are less of an ordeal. Having experienced a diverse itinerary of artworks and texts, postgraduate students are able to engage with the topics of race and ethnicity with greater nuance and sensitivity. This aligns with Ray Chow's perspective on visibility, that being heard is not a matter of shouting louder and louder. It depends first on the establishment of a shared field of intelligibility or understanding, as a condition of possibility for understanding and being understood. As undergraduate students endure one alienating critique after another, they will begin to learn which representations of their ethnicities will be rewarded with visibility and which will be met with silence. A process referred to Chow as coercive mimetism. Artists are made to resemble and replicate the very banal preconceptions that have been appended to them, a process in which they are expected to objectify themselves in accordance with the already seen, and thus to authenticate the familiar imaginings of them as actors. The lack of diversity in discourse surrounding race and ethnicity, coupled with the valorization of certain ethnicities, forces ethnicized artists to subsist within narrow shared fields of intelligibility. Addressing this problem through numeric diversity would prescribe that we work towards a list of different ethnicities and their cultural practice, which would be pretty great. But then it again begins to resemble an object or unattainable object of desire. Instead of asking who or what or how many, my research project asks a structural question of how, and specifically, how does ethnicization occur in visual art practices? Asking the question of how race and ethnicity is represented is hardly new. His 1978 work, Orientalism, Edward Said proposed that the idea of representation is a theatrical one. Orient is a stage which the whole East is confined. Orient then seems to be not an unlimited extension from the familiar European world, but rather a closed field, theatrical stage fixed to Europe. In the ensuing half-century, post-colonial theory should have shaken cultural studies, by extension the visual arts by its foundations. Post-colonial theory has been primarily confined to the field of literature and left to metastasize into a preoccupation with identity politics. To wrap up part one, the issue of diversity is an issue of demographic representation of people and bodies, but also of semiotic representation, how these people and bodies are seen and understood. This is made apparent in the 2018 superhero film Black Panther, while celebrated for featuring a predominantly black cast set in a fictional African state of Wakanda. The film perpetuates a colonial perspective of elitist and violent Africa. Skip that. But part two, essentialists align typical strategies of representation. So, addressing the issue of diversity as a matter of semiotic representation, it becomes evident that diversification can be stifled by essentialism, the belief that things have a set of innate characteristics and attributes. Essentialism is reflected in the ways artists typically, well, I think, is reflected in the ways artists typically address the topics of race and ethnicity by either engaging with familiar imaginings, attempting to obscure their ethnicities, or retreating into nuances of narrative identities. I'm not applying a good or bad framework to these representational strategies, but applying a reductive analysis, we could begin to see the confines of these essentialist aligned practices. It can be argued, though, that there's an alternative approach that for ethnicized artists to take, that they can resist and antagonize. This risks of being reduced to a stereotype of ethnic resistance itself. This often leads to a catch-22 situation where, to critique a stereotype, one must speak in the language of the stereotype, or in some cases, conform to a stereotype. Consequently, artists who resist in this way, knowingly or otherwise, often utilize the first typical representation of practice that engages with the familiar imaginings of stereotypes. This doesn't only apply to works of resistance. Familiar imaginings can be used to convey one's concept, but might inadvertently lead to self-exoticization. In this painting, I want to engage with the cross-cultural dialogue embedded within the history of post-impressionism and incorporated batik motifs to evoke a sense of Indonesia. But I wondered if the praise I received was aimed at the cross-cultural dialogue I intended to address, or simply my ability to aesthetically perform my ethnicity, or both, or none. Lastly, producing art that aligns with familiar imaginings could also bring criticism from other ethnicized artists. Such practices, regardless of an artist's intent, can be perceived as a form of selling out, in the case of emerging artists of being naive. The second typical representation of practice is one that attempts to erase or obscure one's ethnicity and can be achieved in a number of ways. One strategy attempts to obscure one's ethnicity by assimilating artworks embedded within Eurocentric art history. This performance borders appropriated Marina Abramovich and Ulysses and Pontrevilia. It had two men in uniforms flanking the doorway of a classroom and later in a restaging the doorways of the Maya Gallery. This intervention only left a small space for class members or gallery attendees to squeeze past the two performers, an allegory for the obstacles one may face when crossing borders or entering institutional spaces. I think this worked so well, and that's other people telling me, because it activated Chow's mutual fields of understanding. I didn't become white, but I was speaking the language of Western art canon. Another strategy to obscure one ethnicity is to explore other social categories one might be subjected to in general. And lastly, obscuring one ethnicity could also be achieved through the adoption of an international contemporary art style if a style actually exists. Or in other words, you could keep up with the trends. I'm not a trendy person, but I like this painting and I'm painting it while Whisper and the Whisper memes are trending. Such practices, however, risk the criticism that the artist is betraying or abandoning their ethnicities, something not shared by non-ethnicized artists who are rarely perceived to betray or abandon their whiteness, no matter how deep their interest in other cultures manifests in their art. The third typical representation practice involves retreating into one's own lived experience of the stories of histories of those around them. These narrative identities consolidate into concepts related to identity, that is, that of individual identity, that of sameness or identicality, able to nuance the limitations of social categories through personal biographies. I use this strategy in our work, Relational Aesthetics, a series of printed t-shirts that featured my family photos and explored the aestheticization of my family photos and their kind of spread. The narratives also require a flattening of the nuance and intimate stories of histories into these mutual fields of understanding, the narrative of a young immigrant family settling in Australia. Narrative identities could also be woven through art history, something I attended with this painting by incorporating Indonesian batik, Dutch delftware, and post-impressionism itself a convergence of Parisian impressionism and Japanese painting. I tried to continue this with cross-cultural dialogue. With tiles, speaking to Buddhist temples and good block prints, but also addressing that there's a lack of traditional painting practices in cultures situated along the equator due to the humidity and heat of tropical climates. But back on the topic of essentialism, how does essentialism affect visual art practices? Art, commonly seen as a vehicle for self-expression, encourages artists to express themselves, but the partial partitioning of post-colonial theory away from the visual arts has constrained the ways in which racial and ethnic identities are expressed and represented. The reflected in its typical strategies of representation, race and ethnicity is seen as something one is, rather than something one is subjected to, rather than attempting one's own race and ethnicity. I want to address these concepts as concept materials that can be shaped and manipulated like any other material. Part 3. Race and ethnicity as concept material, or atypical strategies of racial and ethnic representation. The 3 I explore in my research project, Judith Butler's performativity, Judith Butler's coalition politics, and Jean Baudrillard's illusion. Strategy A, performativity. Essentialism is often contrasted to social constructionism, the idea that our understanding of reality is mediated by socially bound concepts and labels that change over time. Consequently, the social constructs of race, ethnicity, gender, and so forth all fall short of reflecting inherent truths or essences. But that doesn't invalidate the existence of these essences, but situates them beyond easy and fixed definitions. On the topic of gender, Simone de Beauvoir famously stated that one is not born, or rather becomes a woman, challenging the notion that being a woman and womanhood is a result of biology or essential qualities. Judith Butler extends de Beauvoir's notion of becoming through the concept of performativity that can be appropriated to the constructs of race and ethnicity. Race and ethnicity ought not to be construed as a stable identity or locus of agency from which various acts follow. Rather, race and ethnicity is an identity tenuously constituted in time, instituted in a mysterious space through stylized repetition of acts. Gender isn't something that you are, it's something that you do. Butler's theory of performativity is different from the everyday definition of performativity. The performance, a costume to be put on and off, it comes from speech act theory. I could go on, but I'm not going to. It's kind of complex. But to summarize, performativity is not merely a singular act, but a series of actions guided by cultural and social rule sets, rules to be broken. Butler himself states that, and I've Frankenstein this quote together. The troubling of gender aims not to expose, deconstruct, or reconstruct the gender episteme, but to establish a corporeal field of cultural play that allows for subversive acts or performances. The paintings of Daniel Boyd, a First Nations artist, subverts both as a gesture of ethnic resistance and formatively. His paintings, we call them Pirates Out Here, subverts Fox's landing of Captain Cook at Botany Bay. A gesture that subverts colonial imagery but performs a stereotype of ethnic resistance. Boyd's subversion of performative acts can be observed in paintings like this, that utilizes dot painting, a performative gesture associated with the art of First Nations Australians. Through dot painting, Boyd invites viewers to associate and engage with the image from the First Nations perspective, at least that's what I think. But if you look closer, you'll notice that the dots are not stippled, but serve as a foundational layer on which the image is then subsequently painted. Through the lens of performativity, Boyd's dot paintings not only address histories and images from a First Nations perspective, but also invites audiences to explore how First Nations perspectives are understood and identified through this performative gesture of dot painting. An obstacle addressing race and ethnicity through Butler's performativity is identifying which performative gestures are ethnicized or racialized. Conveniently for me, Indonesia has a number of elements featured on UNESCO's list of intangible cultural heritage, an internationally recognized rule set that includes batik, a process of wax-resist fabric dyeing I hope to subvert. By screen printing low-mounting wax, I hope to make wax-resist fabrics that resemble cyanotypes. This is an actual cyanotypes, this is not a trial. Strategy B, association with our identity. Butler's gender trouble also features their first formulation of a coalition politics, an anarchist coalescing of individuals around a specific political objective that dissipates once the objective is achieved. When applied to non-political goals, Butler's coalition politics is better understood as an association with our identity, and exemplified in the textile assemblages of Nancy Shaver. Her works present an amalgamation of textiles ranging from garments, bath mats, paintings, upholstery, quilts, and embroideries. These textiles come together with the purpose of forming an artwork for the duration of the exhibition and dissipate thereafter. This work, A Many-Sided House, was produced by the Wolf Tones Collective, an ever-changing roster of collaborating artists of which Shaver is a part of. This collective not only demonstrates its association without identity in the artworks produced, but also in the process of making said artworks. The intermingling, rather than a clash of various patterns, processes, and materialities, produces a blurring of social categories and associated performative gestures. This blurring of cultural, sexual, and gender identity is expressed in an excerpt by Herman Melville's Moby Dick, in which the narrator wakes beside a fellow crewmate of South Pacific Islander descent, whose tattoos begin to blend in with the patchwork quilt they're sleeping on. I aim to produce a coalition of motifs, design, and images that would associate with materials, ceramic tiles, or reliefs. This is a painting I ripped up. But also, there are analogous, I hope to explore analogous processes within the tile making process, spread across different cultures. The difficulty in articulating this strategy is that I'm addressing a non-identity to the moment of association. But here are some theories that I hope will help me articulate this one. That's the least, I'm not going to read it. Last strategy C, illusion. Jean Baudrillard is known for the concept of hyperreality, a phenomenon in which contemporary life has become oversaturated with signifiers and images, to the point that our experience of the world is increasingly mediated by signifiers and images rather than direct experience. This is largely due to hyperreal constructs, reductive, refined, and easy to consume, become realer than real and truer than true. To oppose hyperreality, Baudrillard suggests that we should not distinguish the true from the false, but look for the false than false, illusion and appearance, the more fictitious than fiction. An artwork that reflects this strategy is Walid Raad's Atlas Group, a description of which can be found on the organization's webpage. The Atlas Group is a repository of artworks from individuals who were involved in Ruby's Civil War. This artwork was a part of a series submitted by Fadwa Hassoun, a botanist who became an intelligence officer during the war and was responsible for making code names for state leaders. What is omitted from the Atlas Group description, however, is that these audio, visual, and literary documents were fabricated by the Raad himself, that the individuals these documents were attributed to, including military officers, journalists, and academics, were also fictional characters created by Raad. The Atlas Group is an illusion whose account of this Lebanese civil war is more fictitious than the curated narratives of the war, falser than false, more fictitious than fiction. Another illusionary feature of this work is that Raad has since moved on and only provides half explanations of this project. Illusionary artworks must act like mirages in a desert, always out of reach and a clear definition, and risk being subsumed into hyperreality. As I previously stated, Afrofuturism has somewhat been subsumed into hyperreality and has since been kind of replaced with Afro-surrealism. This is straight from Get Out, but also Donald Glover's Atlanta, a short series, possibly. Therefore, any strategy of illusion, or perhaps any strategy that addresses the issue of racial and ethnic representation in the visual arts, is required to remain mobile, fluid, and always a step ahead. And to explore the illusionary technique of world building, with my first point of departure being the Chris knife. June, a sci-fi epic, features Chris knives, blades made from the tooth of a gigantic sandworm. The similarities to Chris are not only in name, but also in the spiritual and cultural significance these knives possess. The June universe also features energy shields that protect the wearer from objects traveling above a certain speed, resulting knife fighting styles that have developed due to this technology resemble Indonesian picak silat or Filipino arnis. I wanted to also develop a type of armor that was inspired by plate mail, which I like painting. But in a rare discussion with my mother about my research project, she reminded me that Indonesians use magic to protect ourselves. Something akin to Dragon Age, a video game that features Kanari, who use magical wall paint, a mixture of magical dust and blood that hardens their skin. Recently I've been using Midjourney to kind of conjure images that are once real, false, past, present, future, and fantasy. But at the same time, none of them. I hope to explore the concept of magic. In an interview with Sarah Thornton, Wangechi Mutu states that there's no word for artist in her mother tongue. She suggests that the closest term is something like magician, or a person who uses objects and imbues them with meaning and power. What could be more fitting than casting one's own magic to counteract the enchanting effects of race and ethnicity? Finally, just a short part 4. Just to be clear, my research project is not aimed to provide a deontological good or bad framework prescribing how artists should practice or how institutions should address matters like diversity. These misconceptions would only position my research project in opposition to art institutions and prevailing trends in the art world, which would only reinforce their power. I'm simply outlining the different ways social categories can be approached in the visual arts and highlighting a difference between essentialist and non-essentialist perspective. But ultimately, being an MFA project, I hope to develop these strategies in my own practice and work towards an artwork that